Do you ever find yourself losing confidence in the gospel? You ever find yourself losing confidence in the gospel? I mean, we have this ancient story about a man who was flogged and then hung on a cross to die a miserable death. And this is somehow supposed to be the answer to all the world's problems. The Apostle Paul himself says that to half the world it sounds like weakness, and to the other half it sounds like foolishness. Elsewhere he calls our message offensive, and Paul's on our side. The church at large has definitely lost confidence in the gospel at various times in its history. So-called liberal theology was an attempt to put the gospel on a more rational footing, more convincing to the postmodern 20th century mind. And in doing so, it gutted the gospel of anything supernatural or miraculous. We can't have a foolish-sounding message. It needs to be clever. Other parts of the church have gone to another extreme. The gospel must be seen to be powerful, they argue. When I was a student back in the 1990s, there was a movement called power evangelism that emphasized the importance of signs and wonders, miracles and healings in the proclamation of the gospel. Perhaps some of you recall the Kansas City prophets and all that. We can't have a weak-sounding message. It needs to be powerful. Still others try to remove any element of God's judgment and God's wrath from the gospel telling so as to make it more palatable in this day and age. Just after the Second World War, my grandfather was vicar at Waltham St. Lawrence, about 10 miles away from here. And he had studied theology before the war at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, which has a reputation for being somewhat theologically reformed. And I once asked him about his experience there, and he said to me, "I couldn't bear it, young Ben. All that talk about blood all the time. We can't have an offensive message. It needs to be mild." What about you? What about your confidence in the gospel message? Your friend is dying of cancer. You know that the most important thing that she needs to hear is that Jesus died in her place to save her, if only she will believe it, if only she will trust him. But the words feel so inadequate in the face of her real pain and loss. They turn to dust in your mouth. Your colleague at work has a gambling problem. It's bringing down his marriage and breaking up his family. You know that the only thing that can truly mend him is the message of the cross. Yet it sounds so irrelevant, so distant from where he is in his situation, and surely he would never listen. You don't know where to start, and in the end, you never do. Losing confidence in the gospel. In the face of real life, it's easy to worry that our message of Jesus will be inadequate or ineffective or irrelevant. But amidst all these attempts to fix up the gospel, to improve it, to dress it up more appropriately for the 21st century, one truth remains. The gospel is not broken. It does not need fixing. We can put our utmost confidence in the gospel as God's plan for saving sinners. That's where we're headed. Okay, that's the conclusion. I brought it out early for you. But the interesting thing is how we're going to get there. So we're going to get there by way of this famous episode in the life of the prophet Elijah. So please turn again to 1 Kings chapter 19. If you have it handy, that will be useful. 1 Kings chapter 19. Where are we in the Bible story? Well, by this point, God's people is divided into two kingdoms. There is a northern kingdom called Israel or Samaria, and there is a southern kingdom called Judah, which is where Jerusalem is. And Elijah is a prophet of God in the northern kingdom, where a character called Ahab has become king. And the Bible's verdict on Ahab is damning. It says that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And among his crimes, Ahab has married a foreigner, Jezebel, and has begun to worship her gods. And she has begun to persecute and kill anyone loyal to Yahweh, Israel's God and ours. So in chapter 18, the previous chapter, Elijah took on the prophets of Baal, one of Jezebel's foreign gods, and scored a magnificent victory. The Lord demonstrated decisively and conclusively that he is God and there is no other. All 450 of the prophets of Baal were slaughtered, and Elijah, the prophet of the true God, was triumphant. Which brings us to the start of 1 Kings 19. Now, the usual way to preach this chapter is to focus on Elijah's mental state. So, for example, we can make quite a nice sermon on dealing with spiritual depression out of verses 1 to 9. But focusing solely on Elijah kind of misses the point. I don't know if this happens to you, but sometimes when I'm watching a play or a TV series, instead of being immersed in the drama, I'll start thinking, oh, he's a good actor. Oh, she's not a very good actor. And I'll begin focusing on that instead. And what's happened is that I've kind of pulled out of the story. I'm no longer immersed in it, and I'm missing the point of the whole thing. And similarly, whenever we read the Old Testament, we shouldn't focus solely on the characters, the people. The first question we ought to be asking is, where is God's covenant? Where is God's covenant? How does this story that we have in front of us, how does it relate to God's overarching promise to bless his people? The Old Testament, the whole Bible really, is all the story of God's covenant from start to finish. And we should try not to lose sight of that. And there it is in 1 Kings chapter 19. It's verse 10 and verse 14. Elijah's focus, when he speaks to God, Elijah's focus is on the covenant. And that should be our focus as well. And these verses, verses 10 and verse 14, they frame the famous part of this passage that's really the turning point here. So reading from verse 11. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. Or you may know it better as a still, small voice. And that's the main question this evening. What on earth is going on here? Why was God not in the wind or the earthquake or in the fire? Why did he speak to Elijah in a gentle whisper? What is going on? Well, by the time we get to verse 9 of the passage of the chapter, Elijah's travelled a long way. This great demonstration that happened on Carmel, the fire coming down and consuming the sacrifices, that seems to have achieved very little indeed, except to provoke Jezebel to threaten Elijah's life. And now he's on the run. And in verse 3, we find he's fled from Carmel, way up in the north, down to Beersheba in Judah, a distance of about 120 miles, a few days' journey. And he arrives exhausted. But the Lord tends to him in his exhaustion and his despair. And the Lord strengthens Elijah for a further journey. And that's where we find the key that begins to unlock this story. Verse 8. Elijah got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Where is this Horeb, this mountain of God? Well, this passage suddenly starts to unlock when you realize that Horeb is Sinai, the very same mountain where Moses met with God centuries earlier and received the covenant. And the importance of this is flagged up for us by the text in God's repeated question. Verses 9 and 13, God asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And this is often understood as being some kind of rebuke to Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here, Elijah? Go back and get on with the work. But I think the right emphasis is something more like, what are you doing here, Elijah? God's emphasis is on the place. This is an invitation for Elijah to explain why he has decided to show up at Horeb / Sinai. And it's not an accident that he's ended up here. In verse 3, Elijah's just run 120 miles from Carmel to Beersheba, and he's exhausted, but he is safe. He's well beyond Jezebel's reach there. So why then would he travel south for a further 250 miles to Horeb? Note that he's plainly done it with God's blessing. In verse 7, the angel of the Lord strengthens him for this very journey. Now, it's not an accident that Elijah has pitched up at Sinai. It's very deliberate. The very same place in which Moses received the law and the covenant back in Exodus. Once we've noticed this, then we can begin to see a whole bunch of other suggestive connections going on. And here are some. The 40 days and nights of Elijah's journey in verse 8 seems to echo the 40 days and nights that Moses spent on the mountain receiving the law. The journey wouldn't normally have taken that long, 250 miles. It looks like a deliberate echo, deliberate link back to the events in Exodus. When Elijah arrives, he finds a cave and he lodges in it. And this may very well be the same cleft in the rock that Moses was hidden in when he witnessed the Lord passing by in Exodus chapter 33. In fact, the very same word that was used when the Lord passed by Moses on Mount Sinai is used in verse 11 when Elijah is told that the Lord is about to pass by. A very deliberate link. And of course, the wind, the earthquake, and the fire of verses 11 and 12 are highly suggestive of Exodus chapter 19, when Israel came to Mount Sinai to receive the law. It says there, the Lord descended on it in fire. The whole mountain trembled violently. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, a theophany. And in verse 13, Elijah pulls his cloak over his face, just as Moses did after meeting with God. The writer invites us to see these echoes, to see these connections. We are supposed to compare and contrast Elijah on Sinai with Moses on Sinai. And then we will get to the point of the text. So God's question is crucial. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? I spent many years working for a large Japanese company, and I used to travel to Tokyo quite often. And on one of my trips, quite a few years ago now, I decided to invest in some noise-cancelling headphones to make the long flights a little more bearable. But when I tried them, it seemed to me that they were not working. My tests indicated no detectable noise-cancelling capability whatsoever. So I decided to take them back to the place I'd bought them from and to get some new ones. But although I took it up with the manager most energetically and largely in sign language, she refused to replace them. She insisted very politely but very firmly that they were not broken. And actually, I have to admit, she turned out to be quite right. It was user error, very embarrassing. But that's another story. But that's what you do, isn't it? If you've bought something that you think is faulty, what do? You take it back to where you got it from. And finally, we understand what Elijah is doing at Mount Sinai. A few hundred years earlier, Moses had received God's covenant there in this very place. This was God's precious promise to Israel that he would be their God and they would be his people. And he gave this promise along with the Ten Commandments, the law, and all the instructions for worship. And it was this covenant that marked out God's people. It was what guaranteed them security and prosperity and favor from God. It ought to have been their most precious possession. And here's Elijah now, a few hundred years later, and he's taking the covenant back to where it came from, returning it to Sinai. Elijah thinks it's broken. He thinks he needs a new one, a more effective one. That's why he's come to Sinai. And we see it in his answer to God's question in verse 10. God asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah replies, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Elijah has just come from the greatest demonstration of God's power that has occurred in his lifetime, and it has made no difference at all. If anything, it's made things worse. The covenant is broken, he's saying. They've broken your altars, they've broken your prophets, and now they're trying to break me. Covenant is broken. I brought it back. Make a new one with me. I am the only one left. What's God going to do? Is the covenant broken beyond repair? Does Elijah need a new one? Now we see the point of verses 11 and 12, finally. And in these peculiar events, this is God saying to Elijah, it's not broken, it's not broken. Elijah had come here looking for a repeat of Moses' Mount Sinai experience. The theophany, the fire, the earthquake, the wind, the loud, thunderous voice. Elijah wanted to hear that thunderous voice once again. He wanted to feel God's presence making the earth shake. He wanted the Lord to descend on it in fire. He wanted a repeat of this theophany that Moses experienced. But what happens? God is not in the wind. God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the fire. Instead of a roar of thunder, there is just a gentle whisper, literally a voice, calm, soft. Now, preachers and writers tend to make a big deal of this still small voice. I've ploughed through all sorts of nonsense, so you don't have to. And I'll save us all time by skipping it now. The whole point here is that it was not a big, loud voice. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, God's voice is described as so loud that the people are terrified. The point being made here is God did not speak to Elijah in the same way he spoke to Moses. Everything is different. God is not in the earthquake, the fire, the wind. The voice is small, not loud. How can we be sure that this gentle whisper here is not the focal point of the passage? Because it has precisely no effect on Elijah. His complaint in verse 10 before hearing the voice is identical to his complaint in verse 14 after hearing the voice. There's nothing to be learned here about prayer or meditation or listening to God in the noise of life or whatever. No, in all these ways, God is saying to Elijah, it's not broken. You don't need a new one. There is not going to be a repeat performance, okay? Politely but firmly, God declines to issue Elijah with a new covenant. No refund, no replacement. The covenant that Elijah's got, God's covenant with Moses, remains the one by which he will continue to work. Despite all appearances, it's not broken. And so in verses 15 to 18 at the end of the passage, we see that God sends Elijah back to get on with his job, enforcing the existing covenant, not a new one. So that's it. That's the one and only point of this sermon. These three words: it's not broken. Okay? Despite all Jezebel's ferocity and all appearances, despite the sin of the people and their total rejection of God, despite all Elijah's circumstances, when he brings the covenant back to God, God simply tells him, Elijah, it's not broken. And we know that God never did break that covenant, despite the strongest possible provocation from his people. But one Friday, about 900 years after Elijah visited Horeb here, God did fulfill and complete that covenant promise when his perfect Son died on a cross to save covenant breakers like you and me. Let's finish by circling back to where we started and join the ends up. If you and I are followers of Jesus, then like Elijah, we are under a covenant with God. God has committed himself to us utterly, and nothing can break that commitment. And our covenant is called the gospel. It is the story of the sacrifice of God's Son in our place and his resurrection to life so that we can know eternal life with God forever. But as we look around at the godlessness of our society, it's easy for us to feel like Elijah did, isn't it? God is dismissed, Christianity is sidelined, or worse. Evil is flourishing, churches are withering. And as we look around at the problems in people's lives, the problems in our own lives, it's easy to fear that the gospel is not enough. How can this strange, simple message deal with the huge and real problems that we face? If it's good enough for the front line in Ukraine, it's certainly sufficient for your and my challenges that we'll face next week. What will God say if we go to him complaining that our gospel message sounds foolish or weak or too offensive? Won't he say the same to us as he said to Elijah? It's not broken. However challenging things seem to be, my gospel covenant is not broken. We don't need a new gospel. We don't need a better gospel. The old gospel in all its apparent foolishness and weakness, it remains the way that God chooses to work in the world even today. Keep proclaiming it, keep living it, keep believing it with all your hearts, and never be tempted to change it. Have confidence that as you tell your friends, your neighbors, your family, your colleagues, this simple, strange message of Jesus, that God is at work, that this is his means of grace, that he will save lives through these words. Perhaps there are one or two here this evening who have not yet put their trust in this message about Jesus, the Son of God, dying on a cross for the forgiveness of sins. Perhaps you've always thought it's a weak message. Perhaps you've always thought it's a foolish message. Perhaps you think it's offensive. Nevertheless, this gospel message remains God's plan to save you, to bless you. And perhaps it's time tonight to take that step and to put your trust in this simple message of a man on a cross. Then you will be able to join us all in saying with the Apostle Paul, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. Amen.